I'll rewrite this historical narrative for you in a completely different style while preserving all the key details and emotional arc. Here's the expanded version. The barbed wire fence surrounding the compound rattled and shook with every gust of wind that swept across the flat Texas landscape. Inside one of the wooden structures that served as a dining facility, rows upon rows of men sat waiting. These were not American soldiers preparing for deployment or farmers gathering for a community meal. These were men who had once marched under a different flag, who had believed themselves destined to reshape the world according to the vision of a madman in Berlin. They wore what remained of their military uniforms, though all the insignia and decorations had been stripped away. Their boots carried the dust of African deserts where they had fought under Rommel's command, and their faces bore the weariness of men who had travelled an impossible distance from certainty to doubt, from conquest to captivity. It was 1944, and the world was still burning with war. But here, in this unlikely corner of America, something unexpected was about to unfold. The mess hall filled with the sounds of shuffling feet and muttered conversations in German. Many of these prisoners still carried themselves with a kind of military bearing, despite their circumstances. They had been taught to believe in their own superiority, in the righteousness of their cause, in the inevitable triumph of their nation. Now they found themselves thousands of miles from home, behind wire, under guard, waiting to be fed by the very people they had been trained to despise. When the kitchen staff began bringing out the meal trays, a strange tension filled the air. The prisoners watched as blocks of golden-coloured bread were placed before them. This was not the white bread they might have expected, nor was it the dense black bread they had known in Germany. It was something altogether different, something they had never encountered before. The texture appeared rough and unrefined. The colour seemed wrong to their European sensibilities. One soldier picked up his portion and examined it with undisguised scepticism. Another tapped his piece against the wooden table, testing its density as if it might be made of something other than flour and meal. Then the mockery began. It started with a few chuckles, then spread like wildfire through the mess hall. One prisoner called out in German that this must be what the Americans fed to their livestock. Another declared loudly that if this was the famous American bread they had heard about, then the United States must be even more backward than their propaganda had suggested. A third man held up his portion and made an exaggerated show of examining it from every angle, as if it were some bizarre artifact from an alien civilization. The laughter grew louder, echoing off the wooden walls. These men who had so recently believed themselves the masters of Europe now found a target for their wounded pride in this simple, humble food. Outside the mess hall, the contradictions and ironies were so profound they almost defied comprehension. These soldiers had participated in campaigns that stretched from North Africa to the Eastern Front. They had marched through villages they helped destroy. They had been part of an army that brought devastation to countless communities. They had believed the speeches and the promises. They had imagined themselves victorious in Moscow, triumphant in London, conquering everywhere they set foot. Yet here they sat, prisoners in a land they had never expected to see, a land that existed so far beyond their previous understanding that even its basic food seemed alien to them. What they were dismissing with such casual contempt was actually a dish that carried within it centuries of American history. This cornbread they mocked had its origins in the agricultural traditions of indigenous peoples who had cultivated maize for thousands of years before any European ever set foot on these shores. When settlers arrived, struggling to survive in an unfamiliar landscape, they learned from those who already knew how to thrive here. Corn became a staple, and the simple bread made from its ground kernels became a symbol of survival, adaptation, and eventual prosperity. Pioneers carried recipes for cornbread across the expanding frontier. Families passed down their particular methods from generation to generation. It appeared on tables in log cabins and plantation houses, in mining camps and fishing villages, at church suppers and harvest celebrations. The prisoners laughing in that Texas mess hall had no knowledge of any of this history. They saw only what appeared to them as crude, coarse, inferior food, suitable perhaps for peasants, but certainly not for men who had once considered themselves an elite fighting force. Their laughter carried within it all the bitterness of defeat, all the desperate need to cling to some shred of superiority even in captivity. If they could not claim victory in battle, they could at least claim cultural refinement, or so they imagined. The sound of their mockery was sharp and cutting, but beneath it ran an undercurrent of something else entirely. There was a nervousness to it, an edge of uncertainty that suggested these men knew, on some level, that their old certainties had already begun to crumble. But the story does not end with that laughter. In fact, that moment of derision was merely the prelude to something far more interesting, far more revealing about both the prisoners and the strange circumstances in which they found themselves. Because what happened next, in the space of just a few minutes, would demonstrate how quickly human pride can give way to basic human need, how swiftly mockery can transform into something approaching wonder. The first bites came grudgingly. Hunger has a way of overcoming pride, and these men had known real hunger in recent months. A few began to eat simply because the food was there and their stomachs were empty. They bit into the golden squares expecting to confirm their worst assumptions, expecting tasteless mush or something dry and difficult to swallow. Instead, they discovered something that caught them completely off guard. The cornbread was warm. It had a subtle sweetness that European bread typically lacked. Butter had been worked into it, leaving it moist and rich. The texture, while different from what they were accustomed to, was not unpleasant at all. In fact, it was deeply satisfying in a way that their meagre rations over the past months had never been. The change in atmosphere was remarkable. The laughter began to fade, replaced by the simple sounds of eating. Forks scraped against tin plates. Jaws worked steadily. Eyes that had been bright with mockery moments before now focused intently on the food before them. One lieutenant, who had been particularly vocal in his disdain, found himself chewing more slowly, his expression shifting from contempt to confusion to something he seemed reluctant to acknowledge. Another prisoner, younger and perhaps less invested in maintaining appearances, closed his eyes briefly as he savoured the unexpected flavours. A third man paused mid-bite, staring at his remaining portion as if it had somehow betrayed him by being delicious. The guards stationed around the perimeter of the mess hall noticed the change immediately. They had been prepared for continued mockery, perhaps even for some prisoners to refuse the food out of stubborn pride. Instead, they witnessed something they had not anticipated. The Germans were eating with genuine appetite. More than that, they seemed to be discovering that the food they had dismissed so contemptuously was actually quite good. One American corporal later recalled feeling almost amused by the sight of these enemy soldiers, these men who had fought against everything America represented, now enthusiastically consuming one of the most humble and traditional dishes of American cuisine. Then came the moment that would be remembered and recounted for years afterward. From somewhere in the middle of the room, a voice called out hesitantly in broken English, "More, please." The words hung in the air for a moment, startling in their simple directness. The guards looked at each other, uncertain how to respond. Was this some kind of trick? Were the prisoners mocking them now? But then another hand rose, and another voice made the same request, then a third and a fourth. Within moments it became clear that this was genuine. These German soldiers, these prisoners of war who had entered the mess hall convinced of their cultural superiority, were asking for second helpings of the cornbread they had ridiculed just minutes earlier. The transformation was so complete, so rapid, that it seemed almost comical. Hardened veterans who had survived brutal campaigns now leaned forward eagerly as more portions were distributed. Men who had been taught to accept nothing from their enemies except perhaps grudging respect now reached out their hands to receive more of this simple American bread. The pride that had sustained them through the initial shock of captivity, the dignity they had tried so hard to maintain, seemed to evaporate in the face of genuine hunger and unexpected pleasure. One prisoner muttered that they were only accepting seconds because they were so desperately hungry, but his words lacked conviction. Another admitted quietly to his neighbour that the bread was actually quite good, and this small confession seemed to open the floodgates. Around the tables, conversations began in hushed German. Some prisoners still tried to rationalize what was happening, insisting that their enthusiasm was purely practical, that they were merely taking advantage of available calories. But others were more honest, acknowledging that they had misjudged this food entirely, that perhaps they had misjudged more than just the food. The cornbread became a focal point for larger questions that were beginning to emerge in their minds. If they had been so completely wrong about something as simple as this bread, what else might they have been wrong about? If American food could surprise them this profoundly, what other assumptions might prove equally false? The guards who distributed the second helpings found themselves in the odd position of serving men who had not long ago been actively trying to kill Americans on battlefields across the ocean. Yet here, in this moment, there was something almost domestic about the scene. Prisoners politely requesting more food, guards accommodating those requests without hostility. The simple transaction of sharing a meal temporarily bridged a gap that warfare had created. It was not friendship exactly, and it certainly was not forgiveness. But it was a recognition of shared humanity, of the basic fact that hunger transcends ideology and appetite cares nothing for politics. As the meal continued and the initial shock wore off, the mood in the mess hall shifted yet again. The tension that had filled the air at the beginning of the meal dissipated. Some of the prisoners actually began to relax slightly, their shoulders losing some of their rigid military bearing. A few quiet jokes were exchanged, not mocking the food now, but gently teasing those who had been most vocal in their initial criticism. One man admitted he had been wrong and received good-natured ribbing from his comrades. Another declared that he would gladly eat this cornbread every day if it meant avoiding the thin, bitter rations they had endured in the final months before capture. This scene, this simple meal in a prisoner of war camp in Texas, represented something larger than just a culinary discovery. It was a crack in the edifice of certainty that these men had built around themselves. They had been indoctrinated to believe certain things about America and Americans. They had been taught that this nation was weak, decadent, racially inferior, incapable of matching the supposed might and purity of the Reich. Yet the cornbread on their plates, along with the generous portions of other foods they received, told a different story entirely. It suggested abundance where they had expected scarcity, generosity where they had anticipated cruelty, and a kind of casual confidence that came from genuine strength rather than desperate bluster. To understand the full impact of this moment, it helps to look backward at what these men had experienced before arriving in American captivity. By 1943, the war had already transformed Europe into a landscape of devastation and deprivation. German cities that had once seemed impregnable now suffered under sustained Allied bombing campaigns. Night after night, aircraft appeared overhead, and when dawn came, new sections of urban areas lay in ruins. The civilian population struggled with increasingly severe rationing. What had begun as minor inconveniences early in the war had become genuine hardship. Bread rations shrank month by month. The bread itself changed, becoming darker and coarser as wheat flour was stretched with inferior grains and various fillers. Sometimes sawdust was mixed in to increase the bulk without adding any nutritional value. Families who had once enjoyed comfortable middle-class lives now stood in long queues hoping to obtain basic necessities. A single egg became a precious commodity. Butter disappeared from most tables. Meat was a rare luxury rather than a regular part of meals. Mothers tried to feed their children adequately while dealing with impossible shortages. Elderly people weakened under the combined stress of fear and malnutrition. The home front suffered even as the propaganda machine continued to insist that victory was inevitable, that sacrifice now would lead to plenty later, that the hardships were temporary inconveniences on the road to ultimate triumph. For the soldiers at the front, conditions were often even worse. The men who would eventually become prisoners in American camps had experienced deprivation that went far beyond civilian rationing. They survived on field rations that grew progressively less adequate as supply lines stretched thinner and resources dwindled. Ersatz coffee, made from roasted grains and acorns, provided no real sustenance, but was drunk anyway because it was hot. Thin soups that were more water than anything else left men perpetually hungry. Tinned meat that had been recycled through so many supply chains that its origins were questionable. The Afrika Korps veterans in particular remembered the brutal combination of desert combat and inadequate food, fighting in extreme conditions while their bodies slowly weakened from caloric deficit. When these men were captured and learned they would be shipped to America, most assumed their suffering would intensify. Why would the victors treat defeated enemies well? In European camps, prisoners typically faced harsh conditions designed to break their spirits. The assumption was that American camps would follow the same pattern, perhaps with additional vindictiveness, given the propaganda both sides had circulated about each other. The prisoners expected hard labor without adequate rest, minimal food that would keep them barely alive but constantly hungry. Deliberate humiliation meant to emphasize their defeat. Some whispered that it might be better to die fighting than to endure what surely awaited them across the Atlantic. These expectations made sense given what they knew of war and captivity. But what they did not know, what they could not have anticipated, was that the United States had committed itself to following the Geneva Convention with remarkable fidelity. This was not pure altruism. American military leaders understood that how the United States treated German and Italian prisoners would likely influence how Allied prisoners were treated in Axis camps. There was also a genuine belief among many Americans that maintaining certain standards, even in wartime, said something important about national character and values. The decision was made that prisoners held in the United States would receive treatment that met international standards and in many cases exceeded them. The numbers tell part of the story. By the summer of 1943, the United States was receiving German prisoners by the thousands. The logistics of housing and feeding such numbers across vast distances required extraordinary organization. Ultimately, more than 370,000 German POWs would be transported to America and distributed among more than 500 camps scattered across the country. These facilities ranged from large compounds that resembled small towns to smaller satellite camps attached to agricultural areas where prisoner labor was needed. The camps appeared in landscapes the German soldiers could never have imagined, from the dense pine forests of the American South to the endless cornfields of the Midwest to the stark deserts of the Southwest. Texas alone became home to more than 78,000 prisoners. The state's vast spaces and agricultural needs made it an ideal location for prisoner camps. The compounds that sprang up across Texas varied in size and configuration, but most followed similar patterns. Barbed wire fencing marked clear perimeters. Guard towers provided surveillance. Inside the wire, barracks housed the prisoners in conditions that were Spartan but not brutal. Many camps included recreation areas, libraries, and facilities for religious services. The goal was containment and control, but not active cruelty. Life inside these camps followed predictable routines. Prisoners rose at dawn for roll call. They performed various tasks throughout the day, with many being assigned to agricultural work alongside American civilians. This was the era when so many American men were overseas fighting, creating severe labor shortages on farms across the country. Farmers welcomed the additional hands, and many prisoners found themselves working in fields that seemed to stretch to the horizon in every direction. The scale of American agriculture amazed them. Fields larger than entire farms back home. Harvests measured in quantities they could barely comprehend. Equipment and machinery that made the work less backbreaking than it had been for centuries in Europe. But it was in the mess halls that the greatest psychological impact occurred. This was where the prisoners confronted most directly the gap between their expectations and reality. The meals provided to POWs in American camps were based on the same rations allocated to American military personnel. This meant quantities of food that seemed almost obscene to men who remembered the shrinking portions and declining quality of German military and civilian rations. White bread appeared regularly on the tables. Beef was served multiple times per week. Potatoes came in generous portions. Fresh milk was available. Vegetables accompanied most meals. And yes, cornbread made frequent appearances, especially in the southern and southwestern camps. The shock of this abundance cannot be overstated. One diary entry that survived from Camp Huntsville in Texas recorded a prisoner's disbelief in stark terms. He wrote that even prisoners in America ate meat twice weekly, while his mother back in Berlin had to wait hours in line for the chance to buy a single egg. The contrast was so extreme it seemed impossible. Some prisoners convinced themselves it must be temporary, that the Americans were fattening them up for some purpose, or that this treatment was reserved only for the early days of captivity before harsher conditions would inevitably emerge. Others theorized that the generous food was a form of psychological warfare, a way to demonstrate American abundance and make the prisoners feel the inadequacy of their own nation's economy. This interpretation had some merit, though it gave the camp administrators more credit for strategic thinking than most deserved. The reality was simpler and perhaps more profound. America had food to spare, and the logistics of maintaining prisoner camps made it easier to provide standard military rations than to create some separate diminished category of sustenance. The generosity was real, but it flowed more from practical abundance than from carefully calculated propaganda. Nevertheless, the effect was undeniable. Every meal became an education in the economic realities that underlay the war. The prisoners began to understand that they were fighting against a nation that was not weakened by war, but strengthened by it, not impoverished, but increasingly prosperous, not struggling to feed its people, but producing massive surpluses. The cornbread, so unremarkable to Americans, became a symbol of this larger truth. Its very plainness emphasized the point. This was everyday food, common food, nothing special or luxurious. Yet it was better than what many German families could obtain with their ration cards. The psychological impact of this realization varied from prisoner to prisoner. Some remained in denial, insisting that what they witnessed must be exceptional, that real Americans surely lived less well than the prisoners saw. Others felt anger at having been lied to by their own propaganda, at having been told America was weak when it was clearly strong. Still others experienced a kind of resigned acceptance, recognizing that they had been part of a losing cause from the beginning, that the industrial and agricultural might they now witnessed had made the outcome of the war inevitable despite any courage or skill German soldiers might have shown. In the midst of these complex reactions, the cornbread continued to appear at meals, continued to be consumed, continued to carry its silent message. The prisoners who had laughed at it that first day gradually came to see it differently. It was no longer foreign or inferior. It became familiar. Some even grew fond of it, looking forward to the meals when it would be served. The transformation was subtle but significant. Food that had symbolized everything alien about America became, over time, something approaching comfort. The guards and camp administrators noticed these shifts in attitude. Most American soldiers assigned to POW camps had mixed feelings about their duties. On one hand, these were enemy soldiers who had fought against America and its allies. On the other hand, they were prisoners now, defeated men far from home, and treating them decently seemed like the right thing to do. The guards watched as initial hostility and suspicion gradually gave way to something more complex. Not friendship exactly, but a kind of wary coexistence that sometimes included moments of surprising connection. Sometimes a guard would share a story about where his family came from, showing photographs of parents or siblings. Sometimes a prisoner would ask about American geography or customs, genuinely curious about this country that had defeated them. These small exchanges happened around the edges of the main routines, brief moments of human contact that reminded both sides that the other consisted of individuals rather than abstract enemies. The cornbread occasionally became part of these exchanges. A guard might joke that it was good stick-to-your-ribs food, perfect for hard work. A prisoner might admit that he had grown to like it. These trivial conversations about food opened tiny spaces for recognition that both groups were simply men trying to get through extraordinary circumstances. Historical records show that the prisoners' attitudes underwent genuine evolution during their time in American captivity. Studies done after the war revealed that many German POWs returned home with significantly altered views of the United States and democratic systems in general. This was not universal. Some remained committed to the ideology that had brought them to war, but a substantial number experienced what might be called ideological softening. They had been taught that democracy was weak and chaotic, that racial diversity led inevitably to social collapse, that American culture was shallow and materialistic. What they witnessed in the camps and through interactions with guards and civilian workers told a different story. They saw an army that functioned effectively despite being drawn from an ethnically diverse population. They observed American guards who seemed content with their lives rather than resentful or oppressed. They noticed that the abundance they experienced was not hoarded by elites, but shared relatively broadly. These observations did not necessarily make them democratic converts, but they planted seeds of doubt about what they had been told. For men whose entire worldview had been constructed around certain assumptions about racial hierarchies and political systems, these doubts were profoundly unsettling. The cornbread fit into this larger pattern of revelation and reconsideration. It was humble food, yes, but it represented something the prisoners had not expected to find in captivity. Evidence that their captors came from a society of genuine plenty rather than imagined weakness. Each bite reinforced a truth that contradicted years of propaganda. America was not on the verge of collapse. Its people were not demoralized and defeated. Its economy had not been ruined by diversity and democracy. Instead, it was producing food in such quantities that even prisoners ate well. Some prisoners tried to maintain their old certainties by arguing that what they witnessed was exceptional, that most Americans surely lived less well than POW camps suggested. But this argument became harder to sustain as the months passed and the abundance never wavered. The cornbread kept appearing. The meals kept including meat and fresh vegetables. The portions never shrank to match the deprivation the prisoners remembered from Europe. Eventually, the weight of evidence became impossible to ignore, even for those most committed to their previous beliefs. In barracks conversations after lights out, debates raged about what it all meant. Some argued passionately that accepting American food did not mean accepting American ideas, that one could acknowledge material prosperity while still believing in the superiority of the system they had fought for. Others suggested that perhaps the connection was deeper, that the prosperity itself demonstrated something important about political and economic organization. These discussions rarely reached clear conclusions, but the fact that they occurred at all marked a significant shift from the certainties with which these men had entered captivity. Letters written home during this period, those that passed through censors and those smuggled out through various means, revealed the psychological complexity of the prisoner experience. Men tried to reassure families that they were being treated adequately without admitting that they were eating better than those families likely were. They described work details and camp routines, but often omitted details about meals that might be difficult to explain. How could they tell a hungry mother or wife that they had refused cornbread at first because it seemed beneath them, only to later request second helpings? How could they admit that the enemy was feeding them generously while their own loved ones went without? The guilt was real and significant. Some prisoners wrote that they wished they could send the food home, that it pained them to have plenty while knowing those they loved were hungry. Others expressed confusion about why Americans would treat defeated enemies so well. A few admitted that the kindness made them uncomfortable, that it would have been easier psychologically to face the harsh treatment they had expected. Generosity can be more disorienting than cruelty when you have been prepared only for the latter. Meanwhile, across America, civilians largely remained unaware of how well German prisoners were being treated. The camps were not secret exactly, but neither were they much discussed in public forums. Some Americans who lived near the camps and saw prisoners working in fields or being transported had mixed reactions. Older generations who remembered World War I sometimes expressed approval for humane treatment of prisoners. Others felt anger that enemy soldiers seemed to be living comfortably while American boys died overseas. The government made little effort to publicize the conditions in POW camps, recognizing that the topic was politically sensitive and potentially inflammatory. The Cornbread, meanwhile, continued its quiet work. It appeared on mess hall tables across the American camp system, from California to Virginia, from Minnesota to Louisiana. Each loaf, each pan, each individual square carried the same implicit message about American abundance and resilience. The story of that first meal in Texas was repeated countless times, with variations as new prisoners arrived and went through their own process of expectation, mockery, discovery, and reluctant appreciation. Some camps developed reputations for particularly good cornbread, with recipes varying slightly based on regional traditions and the preferences of kitchen staff. Prisoners who were transferred between camps sometimes compared the cornbread quality, debating which camp produced the best version. This casual familiarity with a food they had initially rejected marked how thoroughly their attitudes had evolved. They had become, in their way, connoisseurs of American cornbread, able to discuss its texture and sweetness with an expertise born from repeated consumption. The phenomenon extended beyond just cornbread, of course. American cuisine more broadly became familiar to the prisoners. They learned to recognize and appreciate various regional dishes. Some developed tastes for foods they had never encountered before. But cornbread held a special place because of that initial moment of reversal, because it symbolized the gap between expectation and reality more dramatically than other foods did. It was the dish that had first broken through their assumptions, and that gave it lasting significance in their memories. As the war ground toward its conclusion and the certainty of German defeat became undeniable even to the most optimistic prisoners, the mood in the camps shifted again. The initial shock of captivity had long since faded. The rhythms of camp life had become routine. Many prisoners had worked for months or even years at agricultural labor or other tasks, developing skills and knowledge they never expected to acquire. Some had studied English and could converse easily with guards and civilian workers. A few had formed genuine friendships that crossed the line between captor and captive, relationships that would be remembered with fondness despite the strange circumstances of their origin. When news of the German surrender finally reached the camps in May 1945, reactions varied wildly. Some prisoners felt relief that the killing had finally stopped. Others experienced profound grief at the defeat of everything they had fought for. Many felt numb, uncertain what emotions were appropriate. The cornbread appeared on the tables that evening as it had so many evenings before, offering at least the comfort of continuity in a moment when everything else seemed to have changed forever. The question then became what would happen to these hundreds of thousands of prisoners now that the war was over. The answer was complex and gradual. Repatriation took time, with releases scheduled in waves based on various factors, including when and where prisoners had been captured, what work they were doing, and the capacity of transport ships. Some prisoners would remain in American camps well into 1946 before finally boarding ships for Europe. During this strange liminal period, they were no longer prisoners of an active war, but not yet free men either. They waited, worked, ate, and contemplated futures that seemed deeply uncertain. Many used this time to continue their education, studying subjects that might prove useful in the devastated Germany to which they would return. Others simply tried to prepare themselves mentally for what they would find when they got home. Letters from Germany, when they arrived, painted grim pictures: cities in ruins, infrastructure destroyed, widespread hunger, the occupation zones and political divisions that would eventually harden into the Cold War. The prisoners knew they were returning to a country that had been utterly transformed by defeat, a nation that would have to rebuild from almost nothing. In this context, the meals in American camps took on new meaning. They were eating better now than they likely would for years after returning home. Some prisoners tried to savor each meal, knowing that abundance would soon be replaced by scarcity. The cornbread, once mocked, now seemed precious because it represented stability and sufficiency that they might not experience again for a long time. Men who had gained weight during captivity worried about losing it when they returned to a land where food was desperately scarce. When the ships finally began carrying prisoners back across the Atlantic, the journey was laden with complicated emotions. Relief at going home mixed with anxiety about what they would find there. Eagerness to reunite with family members mixed with uncertainty about who might have survived. And woven through all of it was the strange knowledge that they were leaving behind a place that had fed them well, treated them with basic dignity, and challenged many of their assumptions about the world. The ships docked in European ports that bore little resemblance to the cities that had existed before the war. Hamburg, Bremen, and other arrival points showed extensive damage from bombing campaigns. The infrastructure that would be needed to move hundreds of thousands of returning prisoners inland was barely functional. The former POWs found themselves in processing centres, where they were interrogated about their wartime activities, screened for Nazi party affiliations, and eventually released to make their way home by whatever means available. Those journeys through destroyed Germany reinforced what letters had already suggested. The homeland they had fought for no longer existed in any recognizable form. Cities they remembered were now landscapes of rubble. Factories stood as gutted shells.
Housing was desperately inadequate, with multiple families crowded into partially destroyed buildings. Food was even scarcer than it had been during the war's final months. Ration cards provided meagre allowances that left people constantly hungry. Black markets flourished as those with resources traded for essentials. Into this devastation came men whose most recent memories included regular meals of meat, potatoes, vegetables, and yes, cornbread. The contrast was so extreme it seemed almost unreal. Some prisoners felt guilt that they had eaten so well while their families starved. Others felt gratitude for the time they had been spared the worst of the war's destruction. Most felt a complicated mixture of emotions that defied simple categorization. They had been defeated, captured, and held prisoner, yet they had in some ways been fortunate compared to those who had remained free in a nation that was being systematically destroyed. As these former prisoners reunited with families and began the difficult process of rebuilding their lives, many found themselves telling stories about their time in American captivity. These narratives became part of the complex process of making sense of the war and its aftermath. Some families listened with amazement to descriptions of camps where food was plentiful and treatment was relatively humane. Others reacted with skepticism, finding it hard to believe that the enemy would behave so differently from what propaganda had suggested. The cornbread appeared in many of these stories, serving as a kind of shorthand for the larger experience. A former prisoner might describe how he had initially mocked this strange bread, only to come to appreciate it and even crave it. The story encapsulated the journey from certainty to doubt, from European assumptions to American realities. It was a small story about food, but it contained within it much larger questions about what they had believed and what they had discovered.
Some former prisoners admitted years later that cornbread had become a nostalgic taste for them, something they associated not with defeat and captivity, but with a time when they had been adequately fed and relatively safe. In the desperate years of post-war Germany, those memories took on a golden cast. A Bavarian schoolteacher who had been a Wehrmacht corporal wrote in 1947 that he still thought about the cornbread whenever he saw yellow meal in the market. A former sergeant from Hamburg confessed to friends that sometimes he dreamed about the mess halls in Texas, dreams that were neither nightmares nor exactly pleasant, but simply memories of a strange period in his life. This nostalgia could be puzzling to those who had not shared the experience. How could anyone feel fondness for food eaten in captivity? But for those who had been there, it made perfect sense. The cornbread represented a time when the war was over for them personally, when they no longer had to fear death in combat, when they could sleep without worrying about artillery or air raids. It represented relative plenty in the midst of general scarcity. And it represented a discovery that the world was more complex than they had been taught, that enemies could show kindness, that different systems could produce abundance. Historians who later studied the POW experience recognized that something significant had happened in those American camps. The treatment of German prisoners represented what came to be called a soft victory, a triumph achieved not through brutality, but through demonstrating the strength that came from prosperity and confidence. American abundance and American willingness to share that abundance with defeated enemies made a profound impression on men who had expected very different treatment. This did not mean all former POWs became democratic converts or admirers of America, but it did mean that many returned to Germany with more nuanced views than they had held before. The food served in the camps, including and perhaps especially the cornbread, was central to this soft victory. It demonstrated that America's strength came not just from industrial capacity or military might, but from agricultural abundance that allowed the nation to feed its own people, its military, its allies, and even its enemies without hardship. For a country emerging from years of scarcity and rationing, this abundance seemed almost miraculous. It suggested that perhaps the American system, for all its supposed flaws that German propaganda had emphasized, had something to recommend it after all. This realization did not happen all at once, or for all prisoners equally. Some remained committed to the ideology that had brought them to war, dismissing what they had witnessed as exceptional or temporary. But enough prisoners experienced genuine shifts in perspective that the American POW camps became part of the larger project of post-war democratic reconstruction in Germany. Former prisoners who had seen democracy in action, however imperfectly, could speak from personal experience about alternatives to authoritarianism. Some became advocates for political change in Germany, drawing on what they had observed during captivity. The cornbread story became emblematic of this transformation. It was told and retold, each time emphasizing the journey from mockery to appreciation, from certainty to doubt, from rejection to acceptance. The narrative had power because it was simple and concrete. Everyone could understand the moment of tasting something expected to be bad and discovering it was actually good. Everyone could relate to the humbling experience of being proven wrong about an assumption. The cornbread story worked because it was fundamentally human, transcending politics and ideology to touch on universal experiences of surprise and discovery. Decades after the war, some of these former prisoners granted interviews to historians and researchers interested in the POW experience. In these conversations, men now elderly reflected on their time in American camps with remarkable candor. They admitted the contradictions they had felt, the confusion that generous treatment had created, the slow erosion of beliefs they had once held with absolute conviction. And many of them mentioned the cornbread specifically, describing that first meal when they had laughed at what they considered peasant food, only to find themselves asking for more within minutes. One particularly poignant account came from a man who had been captured in Tunisia and spent the remainder of the war in a camp in Kansas. He described how the endless wheat fields had amazed him, stretching to the horizon in every direction, representing an agricultural scale he had never imagined. The cornbread served in the mess hall had come to symbolize for him the extraordinary productivity of this land, the way America could grow food in such quantities that even prisoners ate until they were full. When he returned to Germany in early 1946, he carried with him memories of those golden squares of bread, and when he saw his mother's emaciated face and learned how little food his family had survived on, he understood in a visceral way just how differently the war had affected the two nations. Another former prisoner, captured near the end of the war and held in a camp in Louisiana, recalled how the southern style of cooking had introduced him to flavors he had never encountered. The cornbread there had been slightly different from what prisoners in Texas or Kansas received, sweeter and lighter, often served alongside beans or collard greens. He admitted that at first he found the combinations strange, but over time he grew to appreciate them.
Years later, living in Düsseldorf and working as an accountant, he sometimes tried to recreate cornbread in his own kitchen, never quite achieving the taste he remembered, but enjoying the attempt nonetheless. These individual stories, collected and preserved in archives, reveal the deeply personal impact of what might seem like trivial details. Food matters to people. It connects to memory and emotion in ways that transcend its nutritional function. For these men, cornbread was never just cornbread. It was a marker of a transformative experience, a reminder of a time when their certainties crumbled and new understanding began to emerge. It was also, for some, a guilty pleasure, a taste they associated with being fed by the enemy while their own people starved, a complicated knot of memory they never fully untangled. The significance of these stories extends beyond individual experience to touch on larger historical questions about how societies emerge from conflict. The decision to treat German prisoners well, to feed them adequately, to provide decent conditions in the camps, was part of a broader American approach to the war and its aftermath. American leaders understood that the ultimate goal was not merely to defeat Germany militarily, but to create conditions for a lasting peace. This required demonstrating that democratic systems could be strong without being cruel, that victory did not require vengeance. The cornbread became an unlikely ambassador for these ideas. It could not articulate political philosophy or make arguments about governance, but it could show, in a tangible way, that a diverse democratic society could generate prosperity and share its benefits broadly. When prisoners asked for second helpings, they were not endorsing American political systems consciously. They were simply acknowledging that they were hungry and the food was good. But that acknowledgement carried within it an implicit recognition that their previous understanding had been incomplete at best and actively misleading at worst. In the years immediately after the war, as Germany underwent denazification and reconstruction, the experiences of returned POWs played a subtle but meaningful role in shaping attitudes. Men who had seen alternatives to authoritarian systems could speak from knowledge rather than abstract theory. They had observed how American guards behaved, how civilian workers interacted with them, how local communities near the camps functioned. This observational knowledge provided a counterweight to propaganda that dismissed democracy as weak or chaotic. It did not single-handedly transform German society, but it contributed to creating space for new political possibilities. The cornbread story fits into this broader narrative as a small but vivid detail, the kind of specific memory that makes abstract concepts concrete. Political scientists can discuss democratic institutions and economic systems in theoretical terms, but most people connect more immediately to stories about food and daily life. The image of POW reluctantly tasting cornbread and then asking for more is more memorable and affecting than statistics about agricultural production or tables comparing GDP figures. It works as a story because it is grounded in sensory experience and emotional truth. As the decades passed and World War II receded into history, the generation that had fought it began to age and eventually die. Their stories, including tales of captivity in American POW camps, became increasingly important to preserve before they were lost. Historians conducted oral history projects, recording interviews with veterans while they were still alive to share their memories. In these recordings, the emotion in elderly voices describing that first taste of cornbread decades earlier reveals how powerfully food memories can endure. What seemed trivial at the time, a simple meal in a prison mess hall, had carved itself into memory with surprising depth. These preserved memories now serve as primary sources for understanding not just what happened during the war, but how participants experienced and made sense of those events. The cornbread story appears in academic studies of POW camps, in popular histories of World War II, in museum exhibits about the home front, and in documentary films about the war. Each telling emphasizes different aspects, some focusing on the humorous reversal from mockery to appreciation, others highlighting the broader implications about ideology and reality, still others examining the practical logistics of feeding hundreds of thousands of prisoners.
What remains constant across all these retellings is the central narrative arc, the expectation of deprivation, the appearance of unfamiliar food, the initial rejection based on pride and prejudice, the first reluctant bites, the surprised discovery of quality, the request for more. This sequence captures something essential about human nature and the way experience can challenge belief. It works as a story because it is recognizable even to those who have never been prisoners of war or tasted cornbread. We have all had moments when we misjudged something based on appearance or preconception, only to have direct experience prove us wrong. The enduring power of this story also reflects something about how we prefer to remember difficult periods. The cornbread narrative allows for a way to tell the story of German POWs in America that acknowledges the strangeness and complexity of the situation without dwelling exclusively on suffering or conflict. It finds a middle ground between triumphalism and tragedy, between celebrating American generosity and acknowledging German defeat. The focus on food and the sensory experience of eating creates space for recognition of shared humanity, even amid the larger context of devastating war. In the end, the cornbread served in POW camps across America during World War II was exactly what it appeared to be. Simple, nourishing food made from abundant ingredients and prepared according to traditional recipes. But for the men who ate it, particularly those who came to it with expectations shaped by propaganda and prejudice, it became something more. It became evidence that contradicted their assumptions. It became a daily reminder that the country holding them prisoner was not weak or impoverished, but strong and prosperous. It became a small comfort in difficult circumstances. And it became a memory that would last a lifetime, shaping how they understood their own histories and the larger history of which they had been reluctant participants. The legacy of that cornbread extends beyond individual memories to touch on fundamental questions about conflict and reconciliation. How do enemies become something other than enemies? How do societies move beyond hatred and violence toward new relationships? The answer is never simple, but it often involves small human moments that create space for recognition and understanding. A shared meal can do that. Food eaten together can build bridges that speeches and policies struggle to create. The German prisoners who asked for second helpings of cornbread were not consciously choosing reconciliation, but they were acknowledging their captors' humanity and implicitly questioning the absolute nature of the enmity they had been taught to feel. This is why the story matters, why it has been told and retold, why it appears in histories and memoirs, why it captures something true about the war and its aftermath. In a conflict that claimed tens of millions of lives and caused unimaginable destruction, there is value in finding moments that preserved human connection and dignity. The cornbread story does that. It reminds us that even in the darkest times, small acts of generosity can have profound effects. It shows that transformation can begin with something as simple as discovering that food you mocked is actually delicious. And it suggests that the path from enmity to understanding sometimes runs through the mess hall, where former enemies discover they can share a meal and, in sharing that meal, perhaps begin to see each other differently. So when we remember those German prisoners of war in Texas in 1944, sitting at long wooden tables and reluctantly tasting cornbread for the first time, we should see more than just a humorous anecdote about culinary prejudice overcome. We should see men whose certainties were crumbling, who were discovering that the world was different from what they had been taught, who were taking the first steps on a long journey toward understanding. The cornbread was just bread, yes, but it was also a catalyst, a symbol, and a memory that would endure long after the barbed wire came down and the camps were closed. It was a small thing that mattered in ways no one anticipated at the time, which is perhaps the best kind of historical moment to remember and honor.